Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, America, here in the middle of the country, good old Iowa, Des Moines, Iowa to be exact, here on Iowa Catholic Radio. We are Bo and Bud. You've heard of us, The Uncommon Good, I'm guessing, or otherwise. Well, you could be listening for the first time. If so, we're glad to have you with us. This is The Uncommon Good. I'm Bo Bonner. I am the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing over at Mercy College of Health Sciences. Over here to stage right, here where we're recording, is Bud.
Yes, I am the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences.
So together, our forces combine to make the Uncommon Good.
It's like a transformer.
But only two. And also probably creaky joints at this point. We have to be one of the older Transformers if we were a Transformer.
I feel bad for the generation that immediately followed us because we had Transformers and G.I. Joes, which were really cool, and they got Power Rangers.
Yeah.
And Power Rangers seemed like a lesser version of Transformers. Because the five Rangers would like combine to form something.
Yeah, weren't they all actually just a ripoff of Voltron too, which is like something older? And I think that they were an Americanized version of something that was happening in Japan. Transformers probably too, but actually Transformers, the movie, for instance, actually was made by Japanese animators. Like the cartoon, not this new stuff, which I've never watched.
Newfangled. No, that Power Rangers was live action, which seems okay in theory, but the villain, I really did. I would always just like fly by it, but the villain looked like a not very scary puppet. So I was like, well,
Yeah, we could probably just
these guys aren't even being tested.
Push him over.
This is like the Celtics playing Iowa State or something.
Wow. Yeah. No. So real quick, what's funniest about that is we said this newer Transformers, but isn't the live action one like 10 years or so old itself?
Yeah, I actually watched one of the new Transformers movies. They're very poorly done.
Yeah.
It's when you watch Transformers, you're not looking for epic, I don't know, it's not going to be like Dances with Wolves. That's a what's a movie?
I mean,
that was a misstep.
That's a very correct statement.
What's a movie that makes you think? Ben-Hur.
Okay.
But they're very shallow, and I'm okay with shallow. Like I'll watch a popcorn sort of blockbuster, but it's mind numbing.
You could have gone like Inception or something. Dances with Wolves.
Okay, it's no Arrival. I think that's
Arrival.
Good.
There you go.
Can we move to our underwriter?
That's right. You know what is a good arrival? If in your mailbox you got an acceptance from Mercy College of Health Sciences, who underwrites our show, mchs.edu. If you happen to have been in or around the Community Choice Center earlier this week, you might have heard us cheering very loudly because we had our commencement. Congratulations to all of our graduates who have graduated this semester. That means our summer start is just around the corner as well. But mchs.edu, thank you for underwriting the show, but also kudos to all of our graduates. We're very proud of you.
I'm going to make you blush on air. We don't have a webcam, so that's fine. I was talking to one of our professors this afternoon, and she said her husband was flying back from Atlanta last night, and he told the person in the seat next to him that his wife worked at Mercy College of Health Sciences, and the person next to him happened to be a nurse who studied here. And she said, I love that place. I had a great professor, Bo Bonner.
Oh, my.
Who taught me servant leadership. And unfortunately, he didn't get the student's name, but she lives in Atlanta. She's coming here to visit family.
Oh, wow.
And she was singing your praises.
Well, if that's you, person out from Atlanta, thank you very much for saying that. Thank you for saying that in earshot where people could hear it. I want to say thanks to all the students that we've had, but we're getting ready to come up to the break. But I think you share this sentiment with me, is that whatever else commencement means, It really is a sense of gratitude that we get to be in the lives of so many great people. And I hope that you out there listening get to encounter one of our Mercy College nurses because they're fantastic people. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is wonderful to have you with us, no matter how you are accessing the show, whether that be on the airwaves, on all of the good stations that play Iowa Catholic Radio, iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or our faithful podcast listeners. Thank you for listening to the show. But we started, I don't know if we want to say a precedent, but, you know, we sort of go on tears, right, where we do certain type of shows, certain type of themes. One of the fun ones we did last week is we talked about a tweet. What are they still called tweets, or are they called X's?
I say tweets. I'm kind of frustrated with our culture and its commentary because when people write about content on X, they'll do like X/Twitter in parentheses, say the platform formerly known as Twitter.
It's sort of like Prince when he had like a symbol.
I know, but it was just a bad name change. And I just feel like as we should have a consensus and as a society, just reject it and force Elon Musk to go back to what
or just call it Twitter, but like put the X at the front and consider it silent. That's a good compromise.
Or do like the Big Ten and build the X into the logo somehow. Even though you have 16 teams or 18 teams, you're still a Big Ten.
I do like that. Well, look, we made a comment on, I don't know, it's not like it was a huge trending thing, but it was enough in Catholic Dorkosphere on Twitter to talk about a tweet that sort of brought up ideas of, you know, what is expertise, what is mastery. I had a fun show. I hope people thought it was profitable as well. So I guess to keep that running about things that make a big enough deal on the Catholic nerd interwebs, boy, howdy, did we get an easy layup this week. I think we do a pretty good job of not like pinpointing people or piling on. And even when we try to deal with something that's controversial, I think we usually try to take a step back and say, well, what's sort of like the context of the debate rather than like picking a side of a debate. But I got to admit, something happened in Catholic Twitter land. Well, not Twitter's Catholic sphere online that's sort of impossible not to talk about and not point out who it was and not point out what side you're on. But I think anybody who ran into the AI Father Justin chatbot had to know that after listening to our shows, this was going to fall in our wheelhouse and we were going to have to talk about it.
Yeah.
It has everything, right? Artificial intelligence, the digital reality. Begging us to talk about Marshall McLuhan. I mean, it was just going to happen. So, Bud, you probably being maybe slightly less jaundiced about this whole kerfuffle than me, do you mind giving a neutral's not the right word, but, you know, a charitable read about what happened over this last week?
Well, I was actually a bit nervous for today's show because I'm guessing many of our listeners are fans of Catholic Answers. And
I don't think anything we're going to talk about invalidates being a fan of Catholic Answers.
That's right. But it requires some constructive criticism of Catholic Answers. And what I'll say, Bo, is I think what could very much turn into just piling on. I think there's actually a lot of opportunity for good conversation here. So
exactly,
Catholic Answers exist their apostolate is all about answering people's questions about the faith. And if you've ever tuned into the show, they'll have atheists and fallen away Catholics and committed Catholics, and they'll call and say, like, I've always heard such and such, or I was reading the catechism, and then be able to pose questions to, I'm a big fan of like Jimmy Akins. You know, he's got a lot of interesting things to say.
And a cowboy hat.
A great cowboy hat game. But recently, or this week really, Catholic Answers rolled out a chatbot. So members of their team had designed one of these artificial intelligence, like generative chat feeds.
Yeah, a large language, I forget the third word. But yeah, I mean, it's essentially sort of ChatGPT-4 type technology as a chatbot.
So they rolled this out, and it's fascinating, Bo, because on Twitter, and John Leonetti kind of teases me about this, but I tend to follow a broad swath of commentators because I like to sort of hear what's happening or what people are thinking in different parts of the culture. So, you know, for instance, with like journalism, I don't follow just journalists on the right or in the center, but across the spectrum really in a lot of ways. What's fascinating about Father Justin, this chatbot, is it was almost immediately and universally panned by people who, like, by practicing Catholics and Catholic authors and writers and things like that.
Who would otherwise, up until that moment, probably agreed on very little.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess part of the problem here, well, it got dicey real quick because someone started posting conversations that they'd had with, quote, Father Justin. And there was one that I read where it looked like he was trying to absolve the person's sins. And of course, to simulate a sacrament is an excommunicable offense. But beyond that, there was this real concern, like an authentic concern, that like as we mediate the faith, there's something personal in this encounter that can't be replicated by a robot, for lack of a better term. So there's all this pushback. The one thing that I would like to hear your thoughts on, and I think a really interesting...
Should they have used the name Justin? No. And I have many Justins in my life that I love, but why did they come up with Justin? Anyway,
Justin,
keep going.
come on.
Yeah.
I think it's actually a moment for self-reflection on the part of any of us who are involved with teaching the Catholic faith or promulgating the Catholic faith, because it kind of shines a light that, again, charitably, there's this kind of sense where if you could use a chatbot to answer people's questions about the faith, then the faith is just sort of a paint by color, connect the dots, sort of just like it could be distilled into purely propositional content, whereas the reception of the faith just does not work that way. It's interesting because in the Catholic tradition, we talk about the deposit of faith like a core group of teachings, like a body of teachings that our Lord gave to the apostles and then were passed down. But already in the 19th century, Newman, again, as these things were talked about, he was saying like there's not a way in which you could kind of just number these things out. Mm-hmm. We've talked about this on the show before, but it is important to pay attention to the medium that God used for his self-revelation. So you look at something like sacred scripture, it's not simply a book full of commands or propositions. It's not even a book that's full of historical narratives. Those are a key part of it. But poetry is interwoven with wisdom literature, is interwoven with historical narrative. And that book, like the church has always said, you can only know God by encountering that in its fullness. And then, as we talked about last week, in the context of the liturgy and the ongoing life of the church. And so, again, well-intentioned, but I think with Catholic Answers, and they've since modified what they're doing. I still think they should probably just walk away from it altogether.
Right.
But they've said, they've admitted there's something sort of missing in this approach.
Yeah, not to put too fine a point on it, but the medium is the message. I know we've talked about this and just hammered it, but this is one where it sort of shows up very technically, and I don't know if there's too many defenders besides people at Catholic Answers, but anytime I've heard anyone get anywhere close to defending what kind of went on here, they'll go, well, how is this any different than searching for an answer either like just on Google or, you go to Catholic Answers, the website, and sort of, look
maybe
at
a catechism.
Yeah.
Well, you're saying one that you could enter your own question though.
Yeah. I mean, like, so you go to Catholic Answers site and you use their search bar. So how is this different? And you go, well, again, the medium is the message. There is definitely something about, so let's start back before we get to that. I don't know if people have heard, I know they've heard the concept of the uncanny valley. That gets thrown around a lot. I think sometimes people misunderstand what's being pointed out there. The idea of the uncanny valley, to put it in layman's terms, is the closer a robot or some mechanical thing we've made, the closer it gets to seeming human, it seems like we have good psychological evidence, the more it freaks humans out. And so there's this big question, right, in robotics itself, but just in sort of, even when it comes to medium, right? So like not talking about like R2-D2 and C-3PO, just anything that we've created, any artifice we make, the closer it gets to human, the closer it can get to freaking us out unless there's some sort of remove from it. So let's even think about art. There's a way in which the more realistic, for instance, like a three-dimensional object of art would be, the more it creeps us out. When we see a statue in stone, Bud, we go, wow, that's really good. That looks like a human, but in stone. However, when you see like the wax figurines, like what is that place called in like Mod's Wax Museum, whatever, yeah. Why is that stuff so creepy? Because it's technically more accurate. That's what starts to freak people out, is when there's enough skin, not in the game, but on the game, that you go, something's off about this. And so this uncanny valley aspect, what it's trying to get at is to say, if we don't, the closer that something gets to being us but not us, we have a sort of reticence to it. And what this gets at, right, is there's a way that humans understand that context is important and matters. And when this gets into, okay, I'm looking something up like on Google, but I know that I looked it up, and it's sort of in front of me in a sort of passive state, right? I'm looking through it. I mean, and the thing is that can be deceiving because, of course, Google has algorithms that push at you. There's advertisements. There's a way in which even our interface with books and our computers and our internet are much more proactive about shaping us than we realize. But we all know, right, that just the distance of the screen to me reading it, and the fact that a human might have put that up there, but they're not right there right now, so I have to think about it and mull through it in my mind, it makes a distance that makes a difference. I think most people are creeped out with AI because of this uncanny valley aspect. And so there's this big question. If you go read something that is incorrect about the Catholic faith and later someone corrects you, you go, oh, well, I read a book or I looked on the internet and I probably should have, been a bit more cautious or something like this. But when you start seeing endeavors made to use rhetorical strategies to make it sound convincing, there's a way in which I kind of worry that anything AI priestly chatbot can call into question nearly anything, especially since it's not only that it was simulating sacraments, but it was also giving incorrect answers. Someone asked it if you could baptize with Gatorade, and it said yes. That's not correct. So it's not. So I'm going to stop there because the other thing is about I think we misunderstand AI, but I wanted to throw that back out to you. That seems to be one way in which it just creeped people out. Is what is the main goal? I understand how maybe if it gets information like a search bar, but it turns it into human-like speech, maybe the goal is, that's going to be more digestible to people. But on the other hand, what you might gain in digestibility of rhetoric, which I don't think is much, but that could be argued, I think what you lose is either A, if people are creeped out about it, so they sort of distrust the whole thing, or they're duped by it, and then they sort of turn off their reflective or not critical, but, keeping in mind what things might be.
Yeah, I should have done some research before the show started about AI because I have some limitations in understanding what its capacities are. But to me, Bo, one area where this could lead to real issues is, so you've pointed out before that AI in general kind of reflects the thoughts that we sort of program for it. We give it kind of language structures, and then it can draw on content from databases and things like that and sort of organize them in such a way that it appears to be human language. But it seems to me in science fiction and things that one of the real fears that people have is that AI would take on a life of its own and even sort of overwhelm human culture. Of course, if it's a live robot, so to speak, maybe even enslave us or something. So given combining those two thoughts, it seems to me one area where you could run into some real issues with the use of this technology is you mentioned the incorrect answer with the Gatorade baptism. If AI
real quick, by the way, isn't that hilarious that sentence is real?
I'm trying to connect it with how we celebrate bowl game victories and whatnot.
Yeah, sorry, keep going.
So say the AI went on a tangent, and again, I'm using that language very loosely, but I know there has been AI who, after a certain time, after someone was interacting with it, it started saying things that were objectively racist or really immoral and problematic. What if an AI, because of lack of sufficient oversight or maybe some gaps in the programming, and it was a quote unquote Father Justin, it's a Catholic bot, and it starts saying things that are really problematic, and folks kind of they see this as legitimately sort of a mediator of Catholic thought. And that's where, for me, even with something like apologetics, so apologetics defending the faith in public, it can only be done on a personal level by a human being. And the analogy that I would draw is to the celebration of the sacraments. Like you can't truly participate in the Eucharist and be present for the holy sacrifice of the Mass without being physically present. There's something that's made available by God in the Mass that even like watching it via recording doesn't mediate the fullness of the grace and the symbolism that's there. When it comes to apologetics, we tend to think like, well, this can be done in a different sort of format because isn't it really about providing people with information? And I want to say with the transmission of the Catholic faith, there's still a personal dynamic that it can't be done sufficiently just online, and that there's even potentially problematic elements like the AI going off on a certain direction, or beyond that, someone thinking, oh, I can understand and internalize the faith just by memorizing facts.
Absolutely. And it's that next point that I think is really elemental here and causes the confusion in the context, right? The medium of the transmission causes the issue. It's not so, because sometimes I think what people hear from you and I is like, we think everyone's dumb and they won't get that it's a robot. That's not the point. The point is, from the simplest peasant up to Solomon, what we encounter when it comes to the faith, that there is the information, but there's then the transmission, I guess, and that's not like a secondary. There's something to it. And it's not just that we have a book. In fact, I'm all for problematizing the idea that like even we have made the Bible more of a quote unquote book than it was before the printing press, and that it being proclaimed, and we talked about it with the liturgy and things like this. But there's a difference between finding information, transmitting teaching or handing it on, and witnessing to the truth. Like, those are all related, but distinct. They can be unified if we deal with their distinction. AI can give information. And that's, one thing that we mess up is AI. I think other people truly are worried that like AIs are going to take over and kill us. I do not think that will happen unless a human makes a program to kill people, and then it just has this large language model make it sound nice. But the AI is not going to decide to do anything. That's not how they actually work. They can miscalculate. But again, I don't want to go completely off on AI things. What I'm getting at is you have essentially, and this is where I think when you hear the Catholic Answer folks answering back, they're essentially right that this AI, what has been called Father Justin, and is now just Justin, I guess, according to them.
Yeah.
It's essentially no different than the database of answers that the website Catholic Answers has. That's probably largely true. When you add a large language model, all that really does is create a way that a computer can create responses modeled on how human language works in response to inputs from a human. Mm-hmm. And so instead of just sort of woodenly or mechanically quoting from sources it has, this large language model imitates probability-wise what would likely come next in a sentence, which is why it can sound like it's talking, quote unquote, rather than just retrieving information like a Google search bar does. So it can be conversational. The question is, you can also have large language models that learn from their inputs, and to me, this is not clear what this is doing. So one of you were talking about prior AI chatbots that have like become racist in 3 hours, but that's because they respond to the input that they get. You don't have to do that, and I don't know if Father Justin, quote unquote, was programmed to do that or not. But you're right. Conceivably that could happen, and then like all the problems that you were pointing out. Large language models can also have what's called machine learning, which is a way of essentially eliminating incorrect answers by matching close answers, latency mapping to the truth. I mean, there's all these very technical things. But what this gets down to is, if we think there's a difference between transmitting the seed of faith, the deposit of faith. If there's a difference between transmitting the deposit of faith and witnessing to the truth, and that's different than merely pointing to information, there's a problem, bud, when we make a machine that imitates the medium by which you and I would transmit the deposit of faith and witness to the truth. Google, for all of its problems, and as many, I have nearly as many problems with search bars as I do with AI, but to their credit, they don't imitate the medium of transmission and witness, and AI chatbots do. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. This very interesting topic we'll get more into right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud, we have thrown a lot on the table, so let's set the scene real quick in case people just need a reminder. Again, really preferencing this by pointing out we're not trying to do a takedown of anything Catholic Answers does in general particularly, but specifically in the news, you've probably heard Catholic Answers made an artificial intelligence, an AI, quote-unquote, chatbot that they named Father Justin. And they kind of gave it a story and stuff too, so that might be part of it too that we can get to.
Yeah.
It went bad fast, and I don't even mean like an accusatory pointing the finger. I think they admit, Catholic Answers admit that it ran into what would you say, Bud? Backlash that they did not anticipate.
Yeah.
And I'm with you that the best way that we can say to go forward talking about this is very much a learning moment. Hopefully, where we can pause and ask, why is it that the human Catholics had issues, as it were, with the artificial intelligence chatbot, AI chatbot, named Father Justin? So we left off this last time saying, okay, as far as it goes with just the mere finding of information and presenting it, I don't think there's much difference between an AI chatbot and Google, except for maybe the supposed ease in which it happens, and this is where people like, for instance, at our college get worried. It certainly seems to be easier to copy and paste chatbot text and put it in your paper and act like it's yours.
Yeah, or for the professor to be able to find later what you use.
Yeah. So, I mean, like that I think is a whole different subject here. So my idea mostly is if you have problems with AI chatbots looking up information about the faith, you probably should have worries about Google search bar because you're likely is to find as much wrong things on either. That would be my take. However, I think there's a big distinction to make, and this is where the medium of how we access information matters a lot. Finding information and presenting it is different than transmitting the deposit of faith and witnessing to the truth. Yeah. And the problem with large language model, artificial intelligence chatbots that you name, and then you not only name, but you give the appendage of father and give a backstory, making them seem like priests, is it mimics how we personally witness to the truth interpersonally and mimics the transmission of the deposit of faith. And not just like, random AI chatbot, like, it's a AI Trent Horn, for instance, and I'm not even like being mean. Like if they made an AI of Trent Horn, it would be like, well, his personal authority is being mimicked and imitated. But if you make it a priest, that starts to sound like you're imitating and mimicking the church's institutional way of transmitting the deposit of faith. And I think those latter two, Bud, is where, I don't know if people put it that way, but I think at root, beyond the sort of uncanny valley and like the creepiness, which I think we can get to if we haven't done so sufficiently, I think those two are the most problematic by my take.
Yeah, I've got to preface this next comment by saying whenever we talk about these topics on the radio, I really am. So Bo Pelini, he used to coach football at Nebraska. I'm tempted to get into a larger Bo Pelini conversation, but I'll be good. So he used to say, like, to the media, when I point a finger, I'm pointing 4 back at myself or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so I don't want to appear like I have all the answers. I know the question of catechesis and evangelism, the questions of catechesis and evangelism are challenging topics. They're complex. But I think in this case with Father Justin, the AI bot, it's telling to go back and to contrast what's going on there with how the church in the first centuries introduced people to the faith and led them into a deeper understanding of the faith. And so often if someone was coming out of paganism, the church would require 1 or 2 years of preparation before the person was fully initiated into the sacramental life of the church. And this would involve, withdrawing from previous kind of relationships sometimes, fasting, other forms of asceticism, obviously some mediation of the truths of the faith, but that would kind of take place over time. But it'd be a pretty long, drawn out process that required a lot of sacrifice. Now, there are some listeners here hearing that who may say, yeah, but didn't we basically develop creeds as sort of a shorthand way of remembering the key tenets of the faith? Yes. And that was meant to enable or empower like quick recall of important things. But I would compare the creeds. We could have a whole nother conversation about how like they're a form of worship and adoration in and of themselves. And I would say like the creed as often as possible should be sung.
Well, and like real quick, if you don't mind, like asterisk, I actually think the main part of the creed is in us all saying it together, less than a way in which we transmit information. So it's a start, not a finish. Yep. Sorry. Keep going.
I think so. Every analogy limps in its application, but I think there is an analogy to kind of like learning a sport or learning an instrument. So if you play the violin, there are notes you have to memorize and you have to learn like the substantive content of that. Or if you're learning basketball, the coach is going to tell you like, here's a certain form when you shoot a shot and you want to follow through with your wrist. And they'll have you like, even in sports, sometimes people will learn, certainly in medicine, they'll learn these acronyms or mnemonic devices that help them in the moment quickly recall what they need to know. But that's always integrated with embodied practice. And I would say in the Christian faith, it's the same way, that you learn these creeds, and by singing them in community, they become a part of like the very like air that you breathe, but they can't be divorced from that whole way of life. And that's, see where I led with the preface of like, I don't want to appear that I know it all. I know like so many catechists, we're doing our darndest to like, for instance, with the youth, to like help them to learn the faith and practice the faith. But sometimes we have this like service learning component that we sort of sprinkle on top.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to get to that sort of like, there are these different elements of it and you want them to form a Power Ranger of sorts. But like you think about the heroes of the faith, like someone like Mother Teresa or Teresa of Lisieux, like John Henry Newman, who made these great sacrifices. Someone like Newman, he had like this deep understanding of the propositional content of Catholicism, but until that sort of flowers forth into a lived existence, like we don't call someone a saint. It has to be made active in the world.
No, I mean, to put this, to use a Pope Francis point on this one, which I actually think this quote of his, it gets abused in all sorts of ways. But this is essentially you need to smell like the sheep part, right? Is to say, I think people get this idea of like, well, if you just rub shoulders with, whomever, and you get a photo op, then it's just as disingenuous. But the thing with sport, right, is when someone's practiced for 2 hours because they smell bad, right? Because they themselves were running around and then they had to bump into people who also were sweating. So in the moral life, in the spiritual life, and in the intellectual life, because intellectual life is not just, like you said, it's not just propositional information transfer. You have to smell like the quote-unquote sheep, whatever that might mean. I get how catechism, I get how apologetics easily falls into the temptation in multiple ways to be propositional and non-smelly, quote-unquote. Yeah. There's a way in which people can argue, well, you doofuses are on the radio and on the internet, right? So if people listen to us, are they smelling like sheep? And I hope, right, that it's not just, unless you physically look at someone and bump into them. Like I'm not trying to be like that, like, somehow if you're not in the room with someone, you've not learned anything. But I do hope that there's something we do on this radio show that does mitigate against that. And I think part of it's the form. I think part of the reason why we have what might not be the easy digestible bits of radio show, those radio shows have their place. But this is why I always wanted to do this show. The minute that they ask, I'm like, well, we need to, I will only do this if I can do it with someone. And who I want to do this with is my friend Bud. Because I hope people hear more lived experience, even if they're not in the room with us. That's not to say that, like, we don't fall into these problems. We can get egg-headed. We can get propositional. I understand where that comes from. But like anything catechetical and apologetic has to think this medium of exchange, this medium of this aspect of the ministry of the church has always been about one person asking a question and another answering it.
Yeah.
And that there's something to feeling like someone answered it. That's why I actually think the Catholic Answers radio show, whether people like the content that's given, whether you like this person or that who's on the radio being an apologist, but a human calls in and a human answers, and there's something that seems right about that. And I think I understand, and they had good intentions to go, but we have thousands of questions that people can't answer because, the apologists are busy, and we have all this traffic on the internet. Why wouldn't we try to do something about that? And it is laudable, but unfortunately, I think it is ultimately misplaced for many reasons, but specifically one like you said.
No, man, I think I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this idea because I had a great image come to mind as you were talking. You know the concept of apostolic authority? We say when we talk about apostolic authority, we're saying this person or institution is an authentic purveyor of the truth. And so in the first centuries, though, or in the very time after Christ, to be an apostle meant that you had walked with our Lord. And so when St. Paul emerges on the scene, so he's formally persecuting Christians, and then he has this conversion experience, he would get in debates and with in the context of some of the churches that he had founded. So as you were talking about, I pulled up Galatians, and at Galatia, there's this argument that if an adult man converts to the faith, does he have to be circumcised? Because under the old covenant, a person would have to be circumcised to be part of the people of God.
Right.
And St. Paul, we don't have to get into circumcision today on there. We're sparing you folks.
Yeah.
But as he's making these arguments, like when you kind of read between the lines of the letter, it sounds like some of the Christians were like, well, who's this guy? This Johnny come lately. And there was a question about his apostolic authority because he hadn't actually have walked with Christ. I think he calls himself like the last of the apostles.
Yeah. Born out of time.
Yeah. Christ came to him at, post-resurrection. So, and I'm mixing up letters here, but Paul, the point that I'm trying to make is you talk about the personal nature of authority and teaching the truths of the faith. So Paul in his letters, he's talking about truths. And in one of the letters, I think this is actually 1 to Corinth, he wants the Christians at Corinth to accept the truth. And he says basically don't make me travel over there to prove this to you. He gets sort of heavy handed. Mm-hmm. In Galatia, he makes the same sort of appeal. In chapter 6, near the end of the letter, he says, from now on, let no one cause me trouble, for I bear on my body the marks of Jesus. And it's interesting because here, some Catholic theologians have said, maybe this is the first stigmata, the Greek term that he uses pushes in that direction. Paul might also very likely just be referring to the scars that were left because he was whipped and imprisoned and things like that, which, I would argue that is a form of stigmata, he's conforming himself to Christ.
Right.
But he wants the Galatians to accept the truth by virtue of the truth and how it's presented to them. But his apostolicity is inherently connected to his lived witness of the faith. To give a more mundane example, if someone wanted to, if you were to introduce someone to your mother and there was a really brilliant programmer who programmed even if there was a physical robot and it was programmed to talk and speak like your mother and even give answers that were modeled on how she would communicate, you would say no, this doesn't convey the person of who my mom was. There's something limited in that presentation, severely limited.
Oh, and they're starting to do that. They're making zombies. And it's messed up. So what they'll do, they think they'll be able to do this better and better and more refined, is if you have a family member who dies and they have a sufficient amount of written responses to people, they will place that into the computer and then make a large language model. They'll fill in the gaps with other people. Oh, well, so your mom's personality, what else? Who else was she like? And so then they'll make it where you could have a chatbot where you talk to your mom, supposedly, even though she's been dead 2 years, 10 years, whatever. And I hope everyone is genuinely horrified by this. It's one thing that, with latency mapping and tone matching, you've probably heard this where they have like Johnny Cash singing I'm a Barbie girl, and it sounds like how Johnny Cash might actually have sang Barbie girl or something like this. But on one, you go like, okay, well, that's like making it sound like the person. But when you're saying I am trying to fulfill an emotional need, I mean, that starts to be it, right? Is how is that anything but manipulating people? And I think that is one more way. I don't know if this is what you were walking towards. Inauthenticity, we usually that means like you're real or you're honest. But in this case, we're saying like, no, that is not authentically the person who's now deceased. It is an imitation. It is an extremely good imitation, but an imitation that is manipulating the emotions of people addressing them. It would be crazy. I mean, they're going to be able to do this. If you have a historical person that's written enough, you could jam all of what we have written of them into a large language model, and then you could have people, quote unquote, talk with John Henry Newman or whatever like this. And the thing is people are going to say, oh, I wonder what John Henry Newman would think about video games. And you have to stop people and go, you'll never find out with the large language model. The large language model will imitate the average response that what we have of what a person said might, quote unquote, say. But that is not actually what we don't know. And that starts to get into the Frankenstein sci-fi. It's not like these things are going to take over. It's we're going to dupe ourselves.
Yeah.
Right? That's the sci-fi threat is these are human constructs. Father Justin is a human construct. These zombie version chatbots of dead people are robots that we made. But we're going to want them to be real so bad, bud, that we're going to trick ourselves. And that is the manipulation that I think I understand all of the good intentions and like not really seeing that. But that's the thing we're opening up, and why I think it's right that people said, as Catholics, we just shouldn't do this. We shouldn't make AI priests, not only who by seeming accident simulate sacraments and say that you can baptize in Gatorade. Even if you had one that was perfect and never made a mistake, you shouldn't do that to people. You shouldn't manipulate them or give them even the opportunity to dupe themselves into being manipulated by a thing a human made.
I'm blanking on the precise term, but in the early church, there was an attempt on the part of some to harmonize the gospels. Yeah. So they took the 4 different gospels and tried to come up with a uniform one that combined like different elements of each. And the church, when it canonized scripture, it said, no, you need all 4 in their unique form. I think sometimes, even at the college, but certainly out in the world, with my own sort of conversations about the faith, like sometimes if I'm nuanced, people think I'm being slippery or even liberal, which is funny enough for some of my own commitments. But I think we have to be willing to be accused of that. And the reason I say that, Bo, is so think about truths of the faith that like even contested kind of moral truths that the church has said like, no, we stand firm right here. So like if a student came to me and said, is the Catholic Church opposed to abortion? I think if you said yes and just stop there, you would be not communicating fully what we should communicate as Catholics. So if you say to the student like, well, this is going to take a little bit of time, but I need to talk to you about like the circumstances that bring women to consider this decision, right? The kind of society that we need to strive towards if we're going to encourage women to keep their unborn child. And you start talking about like difficult situations like ectopic pregnancies, the principle of double effect in the practice of medicine, and bringing all those things forward. That's not trying to get out of an answer. It's not, it's not complicating the faith. Most of the truths of the faith, even whether that's moral theology or the 2 natures of Christ, they can't be explained in a sentence. And that's where like Catholic Answers at its best, like you said, a human calling a human. Someone like Jimmy Akin, there's this kind of fleshiness to it and this fullness to it that it couldn't be distilled even down, like getting past like the problematic elements of a bot. Like a search engine approach to learning the faith is problematic on its own.
Well, and then conversely, I think you're absolutely right on that. And to close out this, what a bot will never do, a bot can restate a parable. A bot can never teach a parable. And I will die on that hill. It can repeat parables. It can repeat people's interpretation of parables. A robot will never teach a parable. There is parabolic logic that the New Testament has, which is not open-ended for terms of relativity. It is open-ended because the parable will always be able to speak to our situation. And that is what can't be imitated by a large language model. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is Bud here in spirit. I just want to say he had to run off and do something else as we finish out the show. You're going to have to deal just with me, folks, for the last 5 minutes. I do hope that you, of course, have got to hear the brunt of the show with both of us, because I also hope that one of the things we were talking about, the human element, it's not that shows that have only one person don't have that human element. Of course, it's a human usually talking into the phone, or the microphone, I should say. Just like there isn't a lack of a human element in the AI, like we were talking about earlier. Someone made that, someone put it together. There's actually far more human elements than we usually think of. And that's, I think, part of the problem that sort of messes with our ability to relate to some of these mediums best. But what I will say is things rhetorically, and I know rhetoric can often be seen as strictly negative, but you have to forgive me being a teacher who's taught composition and rhetoric. Rhetoric is something very human, right? How do we anoint? How do we make context? How do we make the surroundings of what we say, make the truth that we're trying to communicate more palatable, to be accepted easier, to make it beautiful for its own sake? So when I say the rhetorical situation can be more human or not, there's all sorts of ways in which having non-rhetorical flourishes, or even again, not humanness in terms of something's not human, but the idea of it being maybe more bereft of the personal element. So like if you want to write law, you're going to write laws rhetorically as sort of plain as possible so that it doesn't sound like a conversation. And there's nothing wrong with that if it's done well. You wouldn't want to write poetry like you would write laws, for instance. So I do hope, though, that we're very mindful at The Uncommon Good, trying to have precisely speaking in a dialogue between myself and Bud, that we get at this. In fact, I hear myself rambling right now, so I'm going to be quiet and say thank you, Bud. I know you couldn't be here for the very end, but I do hope it really is reflective of what we're trying to do with the show. And one last caveat, again, talking about the AI, Father Justin sort of stuff that went on this week is in no way us trying to take barbs at Catholic Answers. Catholic Answers does a wonderful service. There's so many people we know who have been influenced positively and have grown in their faith life because of the shows that they hear here on Iowa Catholic Radio. But it was an event that really got a lot of airplay, and it really was just in our wheelhouse. We've talked to you guys so much about the digital AI Catholic futures. We kind of thought we had to address it. So hopefully, like Bud especially pointed out, that this is a learning experience that we all can grow from. I'm not going to act like I can do Bud's normal ending here as well as he can. I just want to point out that you can go look at Iowa Catholic Radio and see the times that you can pray with all of us. I'm thinking of the Rosary at 10 a.m., for instance, as one of those times particularly to keep in mind. I'll also say that you can go to iowacatholicradio.com and go to events and see the things that are coming up. So, for instance, there's First Friday Mass May 3rd here at Iowa Catholic Radio Station. May 9th is the Iowa Catholic Radio Golf Classic. We have the Tea Room, May 15th. The Forge presents an evening with Dr. John Bishop. And then June 22nd, the Iowa Catholic Radio Family Celebration. All things to keep in mind. But please keep in mind also donating to Iowa Catholic Radio to make this ministry embodied and able to carry through with all that it needs to do. We appreciate all prayers and volunteers who do so much for us, but also this ministry is supported by you. It's your ministry. Please remember to donate at iowacatholicradio.com or 515-223-1150, 515-223-1150. Thanks again for everything, but a shout out to you out in the airwaves. Thank you all for coming and listening to The Uncommon Good. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, families, city, station, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.